Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown, stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the hallway light flickered at odd intervals. Comings and goings were routine, a shuffle of footsteps that no one bothered to track. The mail piled neatly, except for the one envelope that always seemed to be missing. I didn't turn to see or ask who took it. It simply belonged somewhere else. The room felt a degree cooler than it should have been, and the curtains hung just a bit unevenly. I adjusted the blinds without thinking much of it. When I left, I made sure the blinds were uneven again. That's how it started, I think. That's the first memory that feels real when I try to go back. I've been sitting with this for 7 years now, maybe 8. The exact time doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I'm finally ready to say it out loud, to put words to something I've carried like a stone in my chest all this time. I moved across the country afterward. 3,000 miles between me and that place. I told everyone it was for work, for a fresh start, for better weather. All lies that felt easier than the truth. The truth was that I couldn't sleep in that apartment anymore. Couldn't walk down those hallways without my skin crawling. Couldn't look at my reflection in those bathroom mirrors without wondering what might be looking back. But distance doesn't work the way you think it should. I thought if I put enough miles between myself and what happened, it would fade, like a radio signal losing strength. Instead, it's gotten clearer, sharper, like my mind needed time to process what it couldn't handle then. I'm recording this in my kitchen now, 3 time zones away from where it happened. The morning light is clean here, honest. Nothing flickers, nothing moves wrong. But as I speak these words, I can feel that familiar pressure building in my chest, the same one I felt when I lived in that complex. My hands are already starting to shake. Before I tell you what happened, you need to understand what my life was like then. Ordinary doesn't begin to cover it. I worked remote, spent most of my days in that 1-bedroom apartment with my laptop and too much coffee. The building was one of those generic places that could exist anywhere in America. Beige walls, brown carpet, the kind of place where neighbors nod at each other in passing but never learn names. I liked the quiet, liked being left alone. My unit was on the 3rd floor, corner spot with windows facing the courtyard. The rent was reasonable, the internet was fast, and the maintenance requests got handled within a week or 2. Normal problems with normal solutions. The other tenants seemed fine. There was an older woman who always carried grocery bags that looked too heavy for her frame. A young couple who argued in whispers by the mailboxes. A man who wore the same navy jacket every day and never made eye contact. Standard apartment building cast of characters. We all minded our own business. I settled into routines quickly. Morning coffee by the window, work at the kitchen table, evening walks around the complex to get some air. The hallway light flickered sometimes, but maintenance said they were working on it. The mail got mixed up occasionally, but that happens everywhere. Small inconveniences that you adapt to without thinking. But thinking back now, there were patterns I didn't notice then, or maybe I noticed but didn't want to acknowledge them. The flickering light always happened at the same time each evening, right around when I'd finish work and step outside for my walk. The missing mail was always the same type of envelope, always addressed to residents I'd never seen. And there was something else, something I'm only now admitting to myself. I was being watched. Not by cameras or security systems. Those I would have understood. This was different, organic, like the feeling you get when someone stares at you from across a crowded room, except it was constant and I could never locate the source. It started as background noise, the kind of unease you dismiss as stress or too much caffeine, but it grew stronger. The first time I really noticed it, I was making dinner, something simple, pasta with jarred sauce. The kitchen window faced the courtyard, and I'd gotten into the habit of watching the other apartments while I cooked. People coming home from work, kids playing by the fountain, normal evening activity. But that night, the courtyard was empty, completely empty. No movement, no sounds, just the fountain cycling water in mechanical loops. I stood there with my wooden spoon, watching the windows of the other buildings. Every single one was dark, not just dimmed or curtained, but dark in a way that felt wrong. Like the kind of dark you get when power goes out, except I could hear the hum of electricity running through the walls. My own lights were working fine. The fountain was running, but every other unit in the complex looked vacant. I told myself people were out for the evening. Dinner, movies, visiting family, reasonable explanations, but the feeling in my stomach said otherwise. I ate my pasta standing at that window, watching for any sign of life in those dark rectangles. Nothing moved until well past midnight, when a few windows suddenly blazed with light all at once, like someone had thrown a master switch. The next morning, everything was normal again. People in the hallways, cars in the parking spaces, the usual sounds of life resuming. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. But then it happened again and again, always on weeknight evenings, always when I was alone in my kitchen. The courtyard would empty out like someone had called an evacuation, and those windows would go dark in sequence. Not random, not gradual, methodical, like a pattern someone was following. I started keeping track. Tuesday night, empty courtyard. Thursday night, empty courtyard. The following Tuesday, same thing. Always the same nights, always the same progression from normal activity to complete stillness. And always that feeling of being observed from somewhere I couldn't identify. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Maybe there was construction noise on certain nights that drove people inside. Maybe the complex offered group activities I didn't know about. Maybe I was just noticing normal patterns that had always been there. But rationality felt thin when I was standing in that kitchen, watching a space that should have been full of life turn into something that resembled a movie set after the crew had gone home. Then the sounds started. It began with the walls, a soft hissing like air escaping from somewhere deep inside the building's structure. I heard it first in the bathroom, late at night when the complex was quiet. I assumed it was pipes, old plumbing settling, the kind of noise you get used to in older buildings. But this building wasn't old. It had been constructed within the last 5 years, everything still under warranty. The hissing moved, started in the bathroom, then spread to the bedroom walls, then the living room. Always at the same time of night, always with that same steady rhythm. Like breathing, like something large and patient breathing inside the walls themselves. I called maintenance. They came out with their tools and their clipboards, checked the pipes, examined the vents, ran tests I didn't understand. Everything looked normal, they said. No leaks, no pressure issues, no problems with the HVAC system. They suggested I might be hearing sounds from adjacent units, voices or televisions carrying through thin walls. But I knew what voices sounded like. I knew what televisions sounded like. This was neither. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to respond to my presence. When I moved from room to room, the hissing would follow a few seconds later, like it was tracking my location. When I pressed my ear against the wall, it would stop completely, then resume the moment I stepped away. I started sleeping with headphones on, white noise to mask whatever was moving through my walls, but even through the static, I could feel it. A vibration that went deeper than sound, something that touched the bones in my inner ear and made my teeth ache. The smell came next, sweet and metallic like copper pennies dissolved in sugar water. It would appear without warning, usually in the early morning when I was getting ready for the day. I'd walk into the bathroom and there it would be, so strong it made my eyes water. But by the time I finished brushing my teeth, it would be gone completely, replaced by the normal scents of soap and toothpaste. I checked for gas leaks, mold, anything that might explain the odor. Nothing. I bought air fresheners, opened windows, ran fans constantly. The smell kept coming back, always in the same spots, always with that same sickly sweet intensity that made my stomach turn. But it was the mirrors that finally broke my ability to rationalize what was happening. I noticed it first in the bathroom mirror, the large one above the sink. My reflection looked normal, moved when I moved, showed what it should show, but there was a delay, tiny, maybe half a second, but consistent, like watching a video call with poor connection where the audio doesn't quite match the lips. I tested it, raised my hand quickly, watched my reflection follow a beat behind. Turned my head, saw the mirror version catch up a moment later. It was subtle enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been paying attention, but once I noticed, I couldn't unsee it. The delay got longer. What started as half a second stretched to a full second, then two. My reflection began to feel like a separate entity, something that approximated my movements but wasn't quite synchronized with my intentions. I found myself avoiding the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth with my eyes closed, showering without looking at the glass. But the mirror in my bedroom was worse, much worse. I woke up one night to use the bathroom and caught sight of myself in the dresser mirror as I walked past, except it wasn't me walking past. My reflection was standing still, facing the mirror directly, even though I was moving toward the door. I stopped, stared, felt my heart hammering against my ribs. My reflection stared back, but its eyes weren't focused on mine. They were looking at something behind me, something I couldn't see. I spun around, nothing there, empty room, closed door, everything exactly as it should be. But when I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone entirely. The glass showed the room, the bed, the window with its crooked blinds, everything except me. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching that empty mirror, waiting for my reflection to return. It never did. Not that night, not the next morning, not ever again. The mirror in my bedroom stopped showing me completely, like I had ceased to exist for that particular piece of glass. I covered it with a sheet, then with cardboard, then finally turned it to face the wall. But I could still feel it behind me when I slept, that blank surface where my image should have been. I started sleeping on the couch, but the feeling followed me there too, like something was watching from inside every reflective surface in the apartment, waiting for me to let my guard down. The electronic equipment started acting up around the same time. My laptop would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, the screen glowing white and empty. No programs running, no cursor blinking, just that harsh white light filling the room like a spotlight. I'd close it, unplug it, even remove the battery, but it kept happening. White screen, no content, just that burning brightness that hurt to look at directly. My phone began receiving calls at exactly 3 a.m. every single night. No number displayed, no sound when I answered, just an open line with something that might have been breathing on the other end. I blocked unknown numbers, turned the phone off completely, even tried leaving it in another room. The calls kept coming through, somehow bypassing every barrier I put up. The pressure in my chest was constant now. That feeling of being observed had grown into something physical, like invisible hands pressing down on my lungs whenever I was near anything with a screen or a circuit board. The television, the microwave, even my digital alarm clock made my skin crawl with that same electric anxiety. I was losing weight, losing sleep, losing the ability to focus on anything except the growing certainty that my apartment had become something other than what it appeared to be. The walls breathed around me, the mirrors refused to acknowledge my existence, and every electronic device felt like a window for something to watch me through. Then came the night when I finally understood what I was dealing with. I was lying on the couch trying to sleep despite the hissing in the walls and the white glow from my laptop screen when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly in front of my unit. I held my breath, waiting for them to continue past, but they didn't move. The footsteps just stood there. For minutes that stretched into an hour, something waited outside my door in perfect silence. I could feel its presence through the thin wood, patient and focused and utterly still. No shifting weight, no breathing sounds, just the knowledge that something was there, watching my door the way I had watched those empty courtyard windows. I crept to the peephole, pressed my eye against the glass, and looked out into the hallway. The space was empty. Completely empty, lit by that flickering overhead light that maintenance could never seem to fix. But the feeling of presence was stronger than ever, like whatever was out there existed just outside the range of what the peephole could show me. I backed away from the door, and that's when I saw it. In the black screen of my turned-off television, a reflection that shouldn't have been there. Not my reflection, not the room behind me, but something else entirely. A figure standing in my living room, perfectly still, facing the couch where I had been lying. I turned around, nothing there, looked back at the television screen. The figure was still there, clearer now, and it was looking directly at me. Not at where I had been, but at where I was standing in that moment, like it could see me even though I couldn't see it. The figure raised one hand in what might have been a greeting, or a warning. I couldn't tell which, and I didn't wait to find out. I ran, grabbed my keys, my wallet, whatever clothes I could stuff into a bag, and I ran. Down the flickering hallway, past the mailboxes with their missing envelopes, through the lobby and out into the parking lot. I got in my car and drove until the sun came up, then kept driving until I reached a motel 2 states away. I never went back to get the rest of my things. I called the leasing office from the road, broke my lease over the phone, paid whatever penalties they demanded. I told them to donate everything I'd left behind, that I wouldn't be returning to collect it. The woman on the phone sounded confused but processed the paperwork without asking questions. That was 7 years ago, maybe 8. I've built a new life since then, found work, made friends, convinced myself that I'm safe now. But the pressure never left my chest. The feeling of being watched never faded. And sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I catch glimpses of that same figure in dark screens and turned-off monitors. I moved 3,000 miles away, but distance doesn't work the way it should. Whatever was in that apartment, whatever was breathing in those walls and watching from those mirrors, it marked me somehow. Left something behind that I carry with me no matter where I go. I'm telling you this now because I need someone else to know. Need someone else to understand that some places aren't what they seem, that some apartments come with residents you never meet on the lease. But I'm also telling you because I'm scared that talking about it might be a mistake. As I've been speaking, the pressure in my chest has been getting stronger. My laptop screen flickered twice while I was recording this, and I swear I can smell that sweet, metallic scent starting to drift through my kitchen, even though I'm 3,000 miles away from where it started. I thought I had escaped, but I'm beginning to understand that escape might not be possible. That some things follow you no matter how far you run, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The recording is almost finished now, but I don't think I'm alone anymore. I haven't been alone for 7 years. I just finally have the courage to admit it. Story 2. I had been watching the floorboards, eyes tracing the familiar lines where the wood met the wall. The shadows didn't shift, but something in the air felt charged, like a held breath. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the windows, a soft murmur that might have been mistaken for an echo. Each tick of the ceiling fan seemed amplified, its rhythm oddly irregular. My gaze caught the edge of the bookshelf, where the dust had settled uniformly, untouched. Yet something had changed, an inexplicable lightness in the room. That's when I noticed the single bookmark lying on the floor, and that it was never mine. The first dream came on a Tuesday, or maybe it was Wednesday. Sleep had become this fluid thing lately, where I drift off without noticing the transition. One moment I was lying in bed, listening to the familiar creaks of the house settling, and then I was somewhere else entirely. I stood in a room that felt like mine, but wasn't quite right. The walls were the same pale blue, the furniture arranged exactly as I remembered, but there was this light. An oval light, unmoving but pulsing like a breath, always above me. It cast no shadows, created no warmth, just this steady, rhythmic glow that seemed to sync with something deep in my chest. In the dream, there was a constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. Not unpleasant, exactly, but persistent. Like when you leave a television on in another room and can't quite tune it out. I tried to look away from the light, to focus on something else, but my neck felt heavy, unwilling to turn. Then I woke up, just like that, back in my real room, with real shadows and the real ceiling fan ticking its irregular rhythm. I laughed it off, stress probably. Work had been demanding lately, and I'd been drinking too much coffee, staying up too late scrolling through my phone. Dreams like that happen when your mind needs to process things. But the bookmark was still there on the floor when I got up. The second time felt different, longer, more detailed. I was in that same not quite my room, but now I could feel the texture of things. The carpet beneath my feet was softer than it should have been, almost spongy, like walking on moss. The air tasted metallic, sharp, with a scent like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more artificial. The light was still there, pulsing above me, but now it moved, just slightly. A gentle sway as if suspended by something invisible. And the hum had changed too. It was closer now, more complex. Sometimes it sounded almost like a voice, modulated and distant, but speaking in a language I couldn't quite grasp. The words felt familiar in a way that made my skin prickle. I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved. That weightless sensation you get sometimes right before falling asleep, except sustained. My feet were still on that too soft carpet, my arms still at my sides, but something in me was rising, floating upward toward that breathing light. This time when I woke up, I was disoriented. The room felt wrong in the opposite way now, too solid, too heavy. I checked the bookmark on the floor, still there, still not mine. I picked it up and examined it in the morning light. Plain leather, unmarked, with a thin ribbon attached. Nothing special about it, except that I'd never seen it before in my life. That afternoon, I found another one in my kitchen drawer. Same leather, same ribbon. When I held them both, they felt warm in a way that made me uncomfortable. The dreams kept coming, always the same room, always that light, always that frequency humming just at the edge of my understanding. But each time, new details emerged. The walls weren't actually blue, I realized during the third dream. They were white, but the light made them appear blue. And there were others in the room with me, just outside my peripheral vision. I could sense them moving, could hear the soft whisper of their presence, but whenever I tried to turn my head, that same heaviness would settle over my neck. The voice in the hum became clearer, not the words themselves, but the rhythm, the cadence. It was asking me something. The same question over and over in that modulated tone that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to my bones. I wanted to answer, felt compelled to respond, but my mouth wouldn't work in the dream. My tongue felt thick, uncooperative. During the day, I started noticing things, small things at first. The way light would catch certain surfaces in my apartment, creating that same oval glow. The way my refrigerator's hum would occasionally shift pitch, matching the frequency from my dreams. Electronics acting up, my phone's screen flickering with interference patterns that looked almost like language. I found more bookmarks, one in my coat pocket, another between the pages of a book I hadn't opened in months, each one identical, each one impossible to explain. I lined them up on my dresser and counted them, 7, then 8. Then I stopped counting because new ones kept appearing. The fourth dream lasted all night, or felt like it did. In it I could finally turn my head. The room stretched out in all directions, far larger than any room should be. The others were there, standing in a perfect circle around me. I couldn't see their faces, couldn't make out details, but their presence was overwhelming, familiar, like recognizing someone from childhood but not being able to place them. The light descended until it was hovering just above my forehead. Its pulse matched my heartbeat exactly, and I realized it had been doing that all along. The voice in the hum was clearer now, almost understandable. It was asking about the bookmarks, about whether I remembered, about whether I was ready to remember. That's when I noticed my hands. In the dream they were different, smoother. The scar I'd had since childhood from falling off my bike was gone, but when I looked closer there were other marks. Tiny puncture wounds on my fingertips, perfectly symmetrical, like I'd been tested for something. I woke up and immediately checked my hands. The childhood scar was there as it always had been, but so were the puncture wounds, fresh, real, impossible. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur. I'd be sitting at my desk, working, and suddenly hear that frequency humming through the walls. I'd look up and see that oval light reflected in my computer screen, pulsing with the same rhythm. But when I'd turn around, nothing would be there. Time became elastic. I'd sit down to eat breakfast and look up to find the sun setting. I'd start reading a book and finish it without remembering a single page, but somehow knowing the entire story. The bookmarks multiplied. I stopped trying to count them, stopped trying to figure out where they came from. They were just part of my reality now, like the hum that followed me everywhere, like the light that appeared in reflections when I wasn't looking directly at it. People at work started commenting on how tired I looked, how distracted. I'd find myself in conversations I didn't remember starting, giving responses to questions I hadn't heard. My supervisor asked if everything was okay at home. I nodded and smiled and said I'd been having trouble sleeping, which was both true and completely inadequate. The dreams weren't dreams anymore. They were appointments, scheduled visits to that other version of my room, where the others waited in their circle and the light pulsed its questions, and I tried desperately to remember what I was supposed to remember. The voice in the hum was patient but insistent. It knew I was close to understanding. It knew I was almost ready. In what I still called the waking world, things continued to shift. I'd find my furniture rearranged in subtle ways, books moved to different shelves, food in my refrigerator that I didn't remember buying, and always more bookmarks. They were everywhere now, marking places in books I'd never read, holding pages in notebooks I'd never written in, keeping track of something I couldn't identify. The puncture wounds on my fingertips healed and reappeared in cycles. Sometimes they'd be fresh in the morning, sometimes gone by evening. I stopped questioning it, stopped questioning any of it. The part of my mind that insisted on logical explanations had grown quiet, worn down by the constant impossibility of everything. During the fifth dream, or the 15th, or the 50th, I'd lost count, the voice finally became clear. Not the words, which remained in that other language, but the meaning. It was welcoming me back, thanking me for my patience, explaining that the process had taken longer than expected, that my mind had been more resistant than usual, but that we were almost finished now. The others in the circle moved closer. I could see them more clearly now, could make out details that should have been disturbing but felt comforting instead. They looked like me. Not identical, but similar in ways that suggested family, connection, belonging. They were smiling, and their smiles were kind. The light settled against my forehead like a cool hand. The hum filled my entire body, vibrating through my bones, my blood, my thoughts. And suddenly I remembered, not everything but enough. The room, the others, the reason for the bookmarks, the purpose of the puncture wounds, the careful, patient work of bringing me back to myself. I woke up in my bed in my real room with real shadows and the real ceiling fan, but something was different. The bookmark on the floor wasn't alone anymore. There were dozens of them arranged in a perfect circle around my bed, and in the center of the circle there was something else, something that hadn't been there before. A small device, metallic and warm to the touch, with a surface that pulsed with that familiar oval light. When I picked it up, it hummed with the same frequency I'd been hearing in my dreams. The voice spoke to me directly now, no longer modulated or distant. It thanked me for my cooperation. It explained that the integration was complete, that I could return to my normal life now, that everything would go back to the way it was. But it also told me that the bookmarks would remain, as reminders, as anchors, as proof that some experiences transcend the simple categories of dream and reality, of memory and forgetting, of self and other. I placed the device on my nightstand, where it continued to pulse softly. The bookmarks remained in their circle, and when I finally fell back asleep, I dreamed of that room again, but now it felt like coming home. The next morning I woke up watching the floorboards, eyes tracing the familiar lines where the wood met the wall. The shadows didn't shift, but something in the air felt charged, like a held breath. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the windows, a soft murmur that might have been mistaken for an echo. Each tick of the ceiling fan seemed amplified, its rhythm oddly irregular. But this time, when I looked at the bookmarks scattered around my bed, one of them was moving, just slightly, a gentle pulse like breathing, and when I reached for it, it felt warm against my palm, alive in a way that bookmarks should never be. The device on my nightstand hummed once softly, like a satisfied sigh, and I realized that whatever had been happening to me, whatever process I'd been part of, it wasn't ending. It was just beginning, story 3. It wasn't the first time the window was open in the morning. The curtains barely shifted, hanging more out of habit than function. A stray leaf lay on the floor, despite the room being sealed tight the night before. I swept it into the bin without a second thought. The air felt a touch cooler, but the thermostat showed no change. I straightened the cushions on the couch, noting the slight indentation in one of them. The remote control was exactly where it should have been, untouched since yesterday. When I left the room, I made sure to close the door softly. I didn't mind if it stayed ajar. The buzzing started again around noon, not from the refrigerator or the electrical outlets, somewhere deeper, behind the walls maybe, or beneath the floorboards. I pressed my ear against different surfaces, following the sound that seemed to move just as I found it. The vibration traveled up through my skull, settling behind my eyes like a headache that wouldn't form properly. I don't remember what I was doing when it stopped. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked tired, more tired than I felt. The fluorescent bulb above flickered once, twice, then held steady with a light too white for comfort. I splashed cold water on my face and the droplets felt wrong against my skin. Too heavy, too present. When I looked up again, my reflection seemed to be looking at something just over my shoulder. There were lights behind the trees. The coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, still warm despite being empty for hours. Steam rose from nothing, curling upward in patterns that reminded me of something I couldn't place. I touched the ceramic surface and felt a tingling that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest. The sensation lingered long after I pulled my hand away. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at the fence line, the same spot it always barked at, the same urgent, repetitive sound that meant nothing and everything. I watched through the kitchen window as it paced back and forth, hackles raised at empty air. When I blinked, the dog was sitting calmly as if nothing had happened. The door to the living room was open again. I remembered closing it. The memory felt solid, real. My hand on the brass knob, the soft click of the latch engaging. But there it was, hanging ajar just wide enough for someone to slip through sideways. The indentation in the couch cushion was deeper now. I sat in the kitchen chair and tried to remember yesterday. The details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I remembered making breakfast, but not eating it. I remembered the phone ringing, but not answering it. The spaces between actions stretched wide and empty, filled with a presence I couldn't name. The noise didn't come from outside. Time moved strangely in the afternoon. The clock on the microwave showed numbers that didn't connect to each other properly. Minutes stretched into hours, then collapsed back into seconds. I found myself standing in different rooms without remembering the journey between them. My feet tingled as if I'd been walking on surfaces that weren't quite solid. The buzzing returned, stronger this time. It filled the spaces between my thoughts, making everything feel distant and immediate at once. I followed it through the house from room to room, always one step behind its source. In the hallway, the sound seemed to come from above. In the bedroom, from below. In the living room, it surrounded me completely. The window was closed when I checked it. The curtains hung perfectly still. I don't remember ever coming back. The metallic smell started as a whisper in the air, so faint I thought I was imagining it, sharp and clean, like the moment before lightning strikes. It grew stronger as the day wore on, settling in the back of my throat until I could taste it with every breath. I opened windows, turned on fans, but the smell remained. It wasn't coming from anywhere I could identify. My skin felt electric, not painful, just aware of itself in ways it shouldn't be. Every surface I touched seemed to respond, as if the boundary between my body and the world had become negotiable. The sensation was strongest in my fingertips, spreading up through my hands and arms like warm water flowing upstream. The living room door was open again, always open, no matter how many times I closed it. The indentation in the couch had spread to the adjacent cushions, as if someone had been lying down, arms spread wide. The remote control remained exactly where it should be, untouched and somehow accusatory. Evening came without transition. One moment the light outside was neutral and gray, the next it was the deep blue of approaching night. I hadn't noticed the sun moving across the sky. The shadows in the house had shifted without my awareness, creating new geometries in familiar spaces. The reflection in the television screen showed the room behind me, but the proportions were wrong. The ceiling seemed higher, the walls farther apart. When I turned to compare, everything snapped back to normal dimensions. The screen went black, then displayed my reflection perfectly, as if nothing had changed. There were lights behind the trees, brighter now. I made dinner but couldn't remember eating it. The plate sat clean in the sink. evidence of a meal I had no memory of consuming. My stomach felt neither full nor empty, existing in a state between hunger and satisfaction that made no sense. The fork was still warm in my hand when I picked it up to wash it. The dog outside had stopped barking, complete silence where there should have been sound. I looked through the window and saw it sitting in the exact center of the yard, perfectly still, staring up at something in the sky I couldn't see. Its eyes reflected light that had no visible source. The buzzing grew louder as night deepened. It wasn't just a sound anymore, but a feeling, a vibration that started in my bones and worked its way outward. My teeth ached with it. My vision blurred at the edges, as if the world was becoming less solid, more negotiable. I found myself in the living room without remembering the walk from the kitchen. The door hung open, as always. The indentations in the couch cushions had deepened into perfect impressions, as if bodies had been pressed into them with tremendous weight. The air in the room felt thick, occupied. The window was open again. The curtains moved in a breeze I couldn't feel. Time became unreliable. I would look at the clock and see numbers that couldn't be right, then look again to find different numbers that made even less sense. The hands seemed to move independently of each other, creating impossible configurations. Sometimes they moved backward, sometimes they moved too fast to follow. My reflection appeared in surfaces that shouldn't hold reflections. The dark television screen, the black coffee in my mug, the shadow on the wall. Each image showed me from a slightly different angle, as if multiple versions of myself existed simultaneously in the same space. The metallic smell intensified until it became a taste, coating my tongue with something sharp and foreign. My saliva felt different, thicker, charged with an energy that made my mouth tingle. When I touched my lips, my fingers came away feeling electric. I don't remember ever coming back, but I must have gone somewhere. The lights behind the trees were moving now, following patterns that suggested intelligence without revealing purpose. They pulsed in rhythm with the buzzing in my skull, creating a synchronization that felt both coincidental and orchestrated. When I tried to focus on them directly, they shifted position, always remaining just outside clear observation. The living room door was open. It had always been open. The memory of closing it felt false now, a story I had told myself to maintain the illusion of control. The indentations in the couch cushions were perfect now, complete, human-shaped but somehow more than human, as if they contained the essence of presence rather than just its physical impression. My skin tingled constantly now, every nerve ending alive with sensation that had no external cause. The boundary between my body and the air around it became increasingly theoretical. I could feel the room breathing, expanding and contracting in slow, measured breaths that matched my own. The noise didn't come from outside, but it wasn't inside either. It existed in the space between, in the gap where reality bent just enough to allow impossibility through. The buzzing had become a language I almost understood, conveying meaning just beyond the reach of conscious comprehension. Night deepened into something more than darkness. The quality of air changed, becoming heavier, more present. Shadows moved independently of their sources, creating new topographies in familiar spaces. The house felt larger from the inside, as if the walls had stretched to accommodate something that required more room than physics typically allowed. I found myself standing by the open window, though I had no memory of approaching it. The leaf on the floor had multiplied into several leaves, all perfectly dried despite the moisture in the night air. They formed a pattern that looked random but felt intentional, like letters in an alphabet I had never learned to read. The curtains barely shifted, hanging more out of habit than function. The buzzing reached a crescendo that wasn't quite sound, filling every space in my skull until thought became impossible. The lights behind the trees converged into something brighter than the sum of their parts, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. My reflection in the window glass showed someone I almost recognized, wearing my face but looking at something I couldn't see. Time stopped or moved so slowly it felt like stopping. The air became thick as honey, supporting my weight when I began to float just slightly above the floor. The tingling in my skin reached a peak that felt like coming home to a place I had never been. Then morning. The window was open again, the curtains barely shifted, hanging more out of habit than function. A stray leaf lay on the floor, despite the room being sealed tight the night before. I swept it into the bin without a second thought, though my hands shook slightly as I did so. The air felt a touch cooler, but the thermostat showed no change. I straightened the cushions on the couch, noting the slight indentation in one of them. The impression felt familiar, like returning to a conversation that had never quite ended. The remote control was exactly where it should have been, untouched since yesterday, though yesterday felt like a concept rather than a memory. When I left the room, I made sure to close the door softly. The brass knob felt warm under my palm, charged with an energy that traveled up my arm and settled behind my eyes. I didn't mind if it stayed ajar. The buzzing would start again around noon. Story 4. The initial inventory inspection commenced at 1800 hours. Rows of identical boxes lined the shelves, each barcode meticulously recorded. Scanning devices showed all items present and accounted for according to the digital ledger. Temperature controls remained constant, unwavering between documented check-ins. Dust gathered in corners, undisturbed by recent movements. An unopened delivery sat inconspicuously by the entrance, logged but lacking a corresponding dispatch record. All lights functioned properly, though the power indicator flickered irregularly. Exit routes were unobstructed, yet the motion sensors failed to register any activity. The air vent emitted a low hum, yet the security footage looped back 2 minutes. I'm telling you this because I need someone to understand what's still happening to me. Every night the same sequence begins again. The fluorescent bulb above my bed flickers 3 times, then holds steady for exactly 47 seconds before going dark. In that darkness, I hear the scanning devices from that warehouse beeping in perfect rhythm, though I'm nowhere near that place anymore. The sound comes from inside the walls, or maybe from inside my head. I can't tell the difference anymore. My phone turns itself on at the same time each night. The screen glows with that familiar blue light, but it shows no messages, no calls, just the camera app opening by itself. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the black screen before it activates, and my eyes look different, wider, like I'm seeing something that isn't there, or maybe something that is there but shouldn't be. The neighbors think I've lost my mind. They don't hear what I hear. They don't smell that metallic scent that seeps through the ventilation system, sharp and clean like ozone after lightning strikes. They don't feel the vibration that travels through the floorboards, so subtle it might be my own heartbeat, except it comes from below, from somewhere deep underground. I tried explaining it to someone once, told them about the insomnia, about the way electronic devices seem drawn to me now. How my car radio scans through stations by itself, stopping only on static that sounds almost like voices speaking in frequencies just beyond human comprehension. They suggested I see someone, get help, take medication. But medication can't explain why my shadow sometimes moves independently in my peripheral vision. The worst part is the waiting, because I know it's not over. Whatever happened in that warehouse, whatever I witnessed during those missing minutes when the security footage looped, it left something behind. Something that follows me now, patient and persistent. I feel it watching from the spaces between things, from the gap under doors, from the reflection in windows after dark. Sometimes I wake up standing in my kitchen, facing the back door. I have no memory of getting there, no awareness of what drew me from my bed. My hand rests on the door handle, and through the glass I can see my backyard bathed in that same pale light I remember from before. The light that doesn't come from any visible source but seems to emanate from the air itself. The memory comes back in fragments now. I remember standing in that warehouse, surrounded by those perfectly organized shelves when everything went quiet. Not just quiet, silent in a way that felt wrong, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. The scanning devices stopped beeping. The air conditioning stopped humming. Even my own breathing seemed muffled and distant. That's when I noticed the delivery box by the entrance had moved. Not dramatically, just shifted a few inches to the left. The dust pattern beneath it was still intact, as if the box had simply materialized in its new position. I approached it slowly, my footsteps echoing strangely in the artificial silence. The shipping label was blank, white, and pristine, but when I touched it, the paper felt warm. The temperature in the warehouse began to drop. My breath started forming small clouds, and the metal shelving became cold enough to sting when I accidentally brushed against it. But the warmth from that delivery box intensified, radiating outward like it contained something alive, something that generated its own heat. I should have left then, should have walked away and reported the anomaly to someone else, let them deal with whatever was happening. But curiosity held me there, rooted to the spot, as the fluorescent lights began their irregular flickering. Not all at once, but in sequence, as if something was moving between them, casting shadows that didn't correspond to any visible object. The scanning device in my hand started beeping again, but the sound was wrong. Too slow, too rhythmic, like a heartbeat or a countdown. When I looked at the display, it showed readings that made no sense. Barcodes that weren't there, inventory numbers that exceeded what the warehouse could physically contain, temperatures that fluctuated wildly between freezing and scorching. That's when I saw it through the small window near the loading dock, a light in the distance hovering just above the tree line, not moving like an aircraft, not blinking like a radio tower. Just hanging there steady and patient, casting that pale illumination across the landscape. The same light that now visits my backyard, that seeps through my bedroom window, that reflects in surfaces that should be dark. But the light was just the beginning. As I watched it through that warehouse window, I felt something change inside my head. A pressure, gentle but insistent, like fingers probing the edges of my consciousness. My vision began to blur around the periphery, and sounds became distorted, stretched, and compressed like audio being played at the wrong speed. I remember trying to use my radio to call for backup, but only static emerged from the speaker. Static filled with those almost voices, speaking in languages that human throats were never meant to form. The words seemed to bypass my ears entirely, embedding themselves directly into my thoughts, leaving impressions of meaning without comprehension. The last clear memory I have is of walking toward that window, drawn by something I couldn't name. My legs moved without conscious direction, carrying me closer to the glass, closer to that hovering light. The scanning device fell from my hand, clattering on the concrete floor, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. The nothing, a gap in time, a void where minutes or hours should have been. When awareness returned, I was standing in the parking lot outside the warehouse, keys in my hand, no memory of how I'd gotten there. The light was gone. The silence was replaced by normal night sounds, insects, distant traffic, the hum of electrical transformers. Everything appeared normal except for the way my skin tingled, like I'd been exposed to some form of radiation. Going back further, I remember the beginning of that shift. Everything was routine, mundane even. I'd arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in ordinary shades of orange and pink. The warehouse was exactly as it should have been organized, climate-controlled, secure. I'd performed the same inventory check dozens of times before. The air conditioning hummed its familiar tune. The fluorescent lights cast their usual harsh shadows between the shelving units. My scanning device worked perfectly, reading each barcode with mechanical precision. The delivery truck had left that unmarked box, but unusual shipments weren't uncommon. Sometimes paperwork got delayed, or items arrived ahead of their documentation. I remember feeling relaxed, even content. The solitude of the night shift suited me. No coworkers to make small talk with, no supervisors looking over my shoulder, just the peaceful rhythm of checking boxes and recording numbers. The warehouse felt safe, contained, predictable. But now, looking back through the lens of everything that followed, I can see the signs I missed. The way the dust patterns on some shelves seemed too perfect, as if they'd been deliberately arranged. The slight delay in the motion sensors, as if they were tracking something just beyond their programming. The faint metallic smell that I'd attributed to the building's aging ventilation system. Most telling of all was the way I felt completely alone in that warehouse, even though some part of me, some primitive instinct buried deep in my brain stem, insisted that I wasn't. That something else was there, patient and watchful, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The evening had started so normally. I'd driven through familiar streets, parked in my usual spot, used my keycard to enter through the employee entrance. The warehouse welcomed me with its consistent temperature, its orderly rows of inventory, its reliable systems and predictable routines. I had no way of knowing that within hours everything would change, that I would become something different, marked by an experience that exists in the spaces between memory and dream. That I would carry something back with me into the ordinary world, something that watches and waits and follows. Something that's still here with me now, in the darkness behind my eyelids, in the static between radio stations, in the pale light that visits my window each night. Something that isn't finished with me yet. Story 5. I brushed the thin layer of dust from the tabletop and felt a chill run through my fingers. Each particle seemed to clamor for attention, betraying a presence that shouldn't have been. The creak of the wooden floor beneath me was only a shadow in my peripheral awareness. My skin rose with goosebumps as if the room exhaled a secret. The air tasted older, more muted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the dust carried stories I wasn't meant to hear. The first dream came on a Tuesday, though I only remember that detail because I wrote it down afterward. I was lying in my bed, perfectly still, when I noticed the light, not harsh or bright, just there, an oval glow hovering somewhere above my chest, pulsing with the rhythm of breathing. I watched it for what felt like hours, though my body remained heavy, sunk deep into the mattress. The light didn't move, didn't flicker. It simply existed, patient and watchful. When I woke, the ceiling was ordinary again. White paint, a small water stain near the corner. I dismissed it as stress. Work had been demanding, my sleep schedule erratic. Dreams of floating lights seemed reasonable enough for an overtired mind. But the dream returned. The second time I noticed more, the same oval light, but now accompanied by a sound. A low hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones rather than enter through my ears. The frequency felt deliberate, modulated, as if someone were tuning an instrument only I could perceive. The light pulsed in rhythm with the sound, and I realized I could feel both sensations throughout my entire body. My limbs felt weightless, though they never moved. I tried to lift my arm to touch the light, but my muscles wouldn't respond. Not paralyzed exactly, more like I was floating in warm water, every movement cushioned and slow. The hum grew closer, more intimate, and beneath it I heard something else. A voice, maybe, metallic and distant, speaking words I couldn't quite catch. I woke with my heart racing, but the sensation of weightlessness lingered for several minutes. My arms felt strange when I finally moved them, as if they belonged to someone else. That afternoon, I found my coffee mug in the bathroom. I had no memory of taking it there. It sat on the edge of the sink, still warm, though I couldn't remember drinking coffee that morning. The porcelain felt foreign against my palm, too smooth, too perfect. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and noticed a small red mark on my forehead, just above my left eyebrow. It looked like a tiny puncture, though I couldn't recall injuring myself. The mark faded by evening, but the unease remained. The third dream was different, more vivid than any waking moment I could remember. The light appeared immediately, but this time it wasn't alone. Multiple oval shapes hovered above me, arranged in a perfect pattern I somehow recognized but couldn't name. The humming had evolved into something more complex, layered with harmonies that made my teeth ache. I felt myself rising, though my body remained pressed against the bed. The sensation was impossible but undeniable. Part of me lifted while part of me stayed, as if I were being carefully separated from myself. The metallic voice returned, clearer now, though the words remained just beyond comprehension. The sounds felt important, urgent, like instructions I was supposed to remember. The room around me had changed. The walls seemed farther away, the ceiling higher. Everything was the same but wrong, like a photograph slightly out of focus. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but my voice produced no sound. The lights pulsed faster, and I smelled something sharp and clean. Ozone after a storm, but artificial, manufactured. Time moved strangely. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps hours compressed into seconds. I couldn't tell which. The voice spoke again, and this time I almost understood. Almost. The words hovered at the edge of meaning, familiar syllables arranged in unfamiliar patterns. When I woke, my bedroom felt small and cramped. The ceiling pressed down like a lid, and I had to step outside to breathe properly. The morning air tasted flat and stale compared to whatever I had been breathing in the dream. I began noticing things, small things that shouldn't have mattered but did. My radio produced static at specific frequencies, always the same ones. The interference followed a pattern, rhythmic and deliberate, reminiscent of the humming from my dreams. I would turn the dial, searching for clear stations, but the static always returned to those same frequencies. Electronics in my house began behaving strangely. My phone would display missed calls from numbers that didn't exist. The television would turn itself on during the night, always tuned to empty channels that showed nothing but gray snow. I would wake to the soft hiss of static and find the remote control in different rooms, sometimes in places I never went. I started losing time during the day, small gaps at first. I would sit down to eat lunch and suddenly notice the sun had moved across the sky. My food would be gone, though I had no memory of eating it. The taste lingered in my mouth, metallic and strange, nothing like what I had prepared. The dreams continued, growing stronger and more detailed with each occurrence. In the fourth dream, I could move, not my physical body, which remained motionless on the bed, but something else. Some other version of myself that could sit up, stand, walk around the transformed room. The lights followed my movements, maintaining their perfect formation above me no matter where I went. The voice spoke constantly now, and I began to recognize certain words. Not understand them, but recognize their shapes, their weight on the air. They felt like words I had known once and forgotten, like childhood songs half remembered. The metallic quality had softened into something almost familiar, almost comforting. I walked to the window, or where the window should have been. Instead, I found a smooth wall that showed me reflections of rooms I had never seen. In one reflection, I sat at a table covered with dust, brushing particles from the surface with careful fingers. In another, I stood in a hallway lined with doors that opened onto empty sky. The clean, sharp smell grew stronger. It reminded me of hospitals, but warmer, more welcoming. I breathed deeply and felt my lungs fill with something lighter than air. My body, the one lying on the bed, seemed very far away and unimportant. When I woke, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table. My hands were covered with dust, though I couldn't remember touching anything dirty. The dust was fine and gray, almost powdery, and it clung to my skin like it belonged there. I washed my hands 3 times, but traces of it remained under my fingernails. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur. I would hear the humming during quiet moments, usually when I was alone. It would start softly, so softly I thought it might be the refrigerator or the air conditioning. But when I listened carefully, I recognized the pattern from my dreams. The same modulated frequency, the same careful rhythm. Lights appeared in my peripheral vision, not the full oval shapes from the dreams, but glimpses. Flashes of that same warm glow caught in reflective surfaces, in windows, in the black screen of my television. They never appeared when I looked directly, only when I wasn't trying to see them. I began to feel watched, not threatened exactly, but observed, studied, as if something were taking careful notes about my daily routine, my habits, my reactions. The sensation was strongest in my bedroom, but it followed me throughout the house. Sometimes I would turn quickly, hoping to catch whatever was watching, but I found only empty rooms and ordinary shadows. My sleep became fragmented. I would drift off and immediately find myself in the dream space, but now the dream space was everywhere. I could be brushing my teeth and suddenly taste that clean, artificial air. I could be making coffee and hear the metallic voice whispering instructions I couldn't quite grasp. The 5th dream lasted 3 days. Or perhaps 3 days lasted one dream. The distinction had become meaningless. I moved through my house, but it wasn't my house anymore. The rooms were the same size and shape, but the walls showed me other places, other versions of the same spaces, filled with different furniture, different light, different air. The oval lights were constant companions now. They drifted through the rooms like curious pets, occasionally brushing against my skin with touches that felt like warm static. Each contact sent waves of that weightless sensation through my body, and I began to crave the feeling. The voice spoke continuously, and I realized I was beginning to understand, not the words themselves, but their intent. They were explanations, descriptions of processes I couldn't quite visualize, technical discussions about procedures that felt both foreign and familiar. The metallic quality had disappeared entirely, replaced by something that sounded almost like my own voice if I had learned to speak a different language. I walked through my transformed house and found rooms that shouldn't exist. A long corridor lined with windows that showed the same view from different angles. A circular chamber filled with that clean, ozone smell and lit by dozens of the oval lights. A space that might have been a laboratory, though all the equipment was soft and organic, grown rather than built. In the circular chamber, I found a table covered with dust, the same fine, gray particles that had clung to my hands. I brushed them away with careful fingers, and underneath I found photographs, pictures of myself sleeping but taken from impossible angles, from above, from below, from inside the bed itself. In each image, the oval lights hovered nearby, patient and watchful. I studied the photographs and felt a strange recognition, not of seeing them before, but of being present when they were taken. I remembered the sensation of the camera's attention, the gentle weight of observation. The memories felt borrowed, like stories someone had told me about myself. When I finally woke, or thought I woke, I was sitting in my kitchen again. The photographs were spread across the table in front of me, though I knew I had never printed them, never even taken them. My hands were clean this time, but the taste of that artificial air lingered in my mouth. I began to suspect the dreams weren't dreams at all. The realization came gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. Too many details matched, too many impossible things appeared in my waking life. The photographs were real, printed on actual paper with actual ink. The dust under my fingernails contained particles that shouldn't exist in my house, in my neighborhood, possibly anywhere on Earth. I tested myself looking for evidence. I placed objects in specific positions before sleeping, then checked their locations when I woke. They had always moved, not randomly, but purposefully, arranged in patterns that reminded me of the light formations from my dreams. I recorded myself sleeping using an old camera with a timer function. The footage showed me lying motionless for hours, but the audio captured sounds that shouldn't have been there. The humming, the metallic voice, and underneath it all, my own voice responding in that foreign language I was slowly learning to understand. In the recordings, I could see faint distortions in the air above my body, shapes that might have been lights if the camera could properly capture their frequency. Shadows that moved independently of any light source, and in the background, barely visible, the suggestion of other figures, tall, patient shapes that stood at the edges of the frame and watched. I stopped being afraid. The fear had been replaced by something else, something that felt like anticipation. Like coming home after a long journey to a place I had forgotten I loved. The sixth dream began while I was awake. I was making breakfast, ordinary movements in an ordinary kitchen when the humming started. This time I didn't question it, didn't try to find its source. I simply listened as the familiar frequency filled the room, and I felt my body begin to lighten. The oval lights appeared gradually, materializing like morning mist. They took their positions above me with practiced ease, and I realized this dance was old, well rehearsed. We had done this many times before. The recognition was complete now, undeniable. The voice spoke, and I understood every word. It told me about the gap in my memory, about the careful editing that had been necessary, about the procedures that required consent, even when the consent had to be obtained retroactively through dreams and gradual revelation, about the importance of voluntary participation, of genuine understanding rather than forced compliance. I listened and remembered, not everything, but enough to know that the dust on my fingers came from places I had visited in more than dreams. Enough to understand that the photographs documented real events, real procedures, real transformations that were still ongoing. The voice explained that the process was nearly complete, that soon I would remember everything, and the distinction between dream and reality would become irrelevant. That I would be able to move freely between the spaces I had been visiting, to participate fully in work that spanned dimensions I was only beginning to perceive. I asked if I had chosen this, and the voice assured me that I had. that I continued to choose it every night, every dream, every moment of growing understanding. That choice was the foundation of everything they did, everything we did together. When the dream ended, I was sitting at my kitchen table, but now the table was covered with equipment I recognized from the circular chamber. Organic instruments that pulsed with their own light, tools designed for procedures I was beginning to remember. My hands moved over them with practiced familiarity, checking connections, calibrating frequencies, preparing for work I knew how to do. I looked up and saw my reflection in the kitchen window, but it wasn't quite my reflection. The face was mine, but the eyes held knowledge I was still acquiring. The expression was mine, but it belonged to someone who had learned to exist in multiple spaces simultaneously. Tonight, I know, will be different. The dreams have been preparation, gentle introduction to a reality larger than the one I thought I inhabited. Tonight I will remember everything, and tomorrow I will wake up somewhere else entirely. Or perhaps I will wake up here, but here will be somewhere else. I'm not afraid. The anticipation has grown into eagerness, into hunger for completion. I understand now that the dust on my fingers was always there, that the photographs were always waiting to be developed, that the voice was always my own voice speaking from a future I was moving toward. The lights are beginning to appear again, even though I'm awake, even though it's still afternoon. They pulse with gentle patience, ready to guide me through the final transition. The humming has started, and I can feel my body preparing to lighten, to separate, to join the other version of myself that has been waiting in the circular chamber. I brush the dust from the tabletop one more time, and each particle sparkles with recognition. They know me, these fragments from other spaces, other realities. They've been marking my path, leaving traces for me to follow home. The room exhales its secret, and now I understand what it was trying to tell me. I close my eyes and feel myself beginning to rise. When I open them again, I'm lying in my bed, perfectly still, watching an oval light pulse above my chest. The dream is beginning, just like always, but this time when I try to move my arm, it responds immediately. This time when I sit up to touch the light, my body follows my intention without resistance. This time the light is warm against my palm and solid and real. And the dust on my fingers proves that I was never dreaming at all. Story 6. There was a time when I dismissed it as mere coincidence, something that existed in the periphery of my daily routine. Every morning while sipping my coffee, I'd notice a pair of shoes left outside the neighboring door, the same pair, side by side, always facing the same direction. Yet one day the left shoe was inexplicably turned at an angle. I shrugged it off at first, until it happened again, the same shoe, now slightly scuffed. Yesterday I noticed a new pair, but only one shoe was there. The other had vanished, leaving behind a hint of unease I can't quite shake. That unease has grown into something else entirely, something that makes me question not just what I see, but what I remember seeing. There are gaps in my memory now, spaces where experiences should be but aren't. I know something happened to me, something significant enough that my mind feels different, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room. The angles are wrong, the shadows fall where they shouldn't. I've been trying to piece it together, this missing fragment of my life. It's like reaching for water with cupped hands. The harder I grasp, the more it slips away. But there are traces, breadcrumbs scattered through my apartment, evidence of an experience I can no longer fully access. The first concrete clue appeared when I was cleaning out old files on my phone. Buried between photos of mundane meals and screenshots I'd forgotten to delete, I found an audio recording I didn't remember making. The file name was just numbers, a timestamp that meant nothing to me. When I pressed play, static filled my earbuds, not the clean white noise of an empty room, but something organic, like breathing through interference. Underneath the static, I could hear my own voice, distant and hollow. It's happening again. The frequency is changing. Then silence. 47 seconds of nothing but that breathing static before the recording cut off. I played it again and again. Each time I caught fragments I'd missed before. A low humming that seemed to pulse with irregular rhythm. The faint sound of something moving, like fabric dragging across a hard surface. And beneath it all, my voice, barely a whisper. They're not supposed to be able to do that. Who was I talking about? What weren't they supposed to do? The questions triggered something, not a memory exactly, but a sensation. The taste of copper on my tongue. The feeling of standing in a room where the walls seemed to bend slightly inward. I remembered being very still, holding my breath, listening to sounds that didn't match what I was seeing. That first fragment came to me while I was making dinner. My hands were busy chopping vegetables, but my mind was elsewhere, sifting through the static of that recording. Suddenly, I wasn't in my kitchen anymore. I was standing in darkness, watching lights move in patterns that hurt to follow. Not lights exactly, more like tears in something dark, revealing brightness underneath. They moved with purpose, forming shapes that almost made sense before dissolving into chaos. In that fragment, I could hear voices, but they were wrong. The words were familiar, conversational even, but they came from the wrong directions. A voice that should have been in front of me emerged from somewhere behind my left shoulder. Another seemed to originate from inside my own chest. The disconnect was nauseating, like trying to focus on an object while spinning. I snapped back to my kitchen to find the knife trembling in my hand. The vegetables lay abandoned, half-chopped. The air carried a scent I couldn't place, something like new plastic mixed with the metallic smell of cold blood. The second fragment came through an object I found tucked behind my bookshelf. A small device, smooth and warm to the touch, about the size of a phone but thicker. Its surface was unmarked except for what looked like a speaker grill on one side. When I picked it up, it vibrated gently, irregularly, like a heartbeat with an arrhythmia. Holding it triggered another flash of memory. I was in the same dark space, but this time I could sense something behind me. Not see it, the darkness was too complete for that, but feel its presence like a change in air pressure. Whatever it was large and patient, waiting. The voices were clearer in this fragment. They spoke in normal tones about normal things, the weather, plans for the weekend, a restaurant recommendation. But the words didn't align with the movements of the speakers. I watched shadows gesture while different shadows spoke, creating a conversational choreography that made no sense. Then came the sound that wasn't quite human, a vocalization that started like laughter but stretched into something else, something that made my skin crawl even in memory. It came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me without having a source. I dropped the device. It clattered to the floor, still vibrating, and I backed away from it like it might bite. But even as I retreated, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fragment wasn't complete. There was more, something crucial hiding just beyond the edge of recall. That's when the present began to fracture. It started small. I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in windows and mirrors, but the reflection would be facing the wrong direction or moving a fraction of a second out of sync. The bathroom mirror was the worst. Sometimes my reflection would blink first or smile when I wasn't smiling. The sounds came next, soft electronic tones that seemed to emanate from inside the walls. They'd start low and rise in frequency until they became almost painful, then cut off abruptly. I'd hear them at random moments while brushing my teeth, reading, trying to sleep. always when I was alone, always from no identifiable source. I began to suspect that my investigation was triggering something, that the act of remembering was somehow reactivating whatever had happened to me. The boundaries between past and present were becoming permeable, allowing fragments of that missing experience to bleed through into my current reality. The final fragment arrived without warning. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the mysterious device, when the memory crashed over me like a wave. This time, it wasn't just visual or auditory, it was complete sensory immersion. I was back in that dark space, but now I could see more. The room was impossibly large, stretching beyond what my eyes could penetrate. The moving lights weren't random, they were scanning, searching, painting geometric patterns across surfaces that shouldn't exist. The patterns were too complex, too perfect. No human hand could have created them. But what disturbed me most was what I saw when the lights swept across the other figures in the room. There were people there, at least they had been people. They stood motionless, their faces turned upward toward something I couldn't see. Their expressions were blank, peaceful even, but their eyes reflected the scanning lights like mirrors. I realized I was one of them, standing perfectly still, face upturned, while those impossible lights painted their patterns across my skin. The voices I'd been hearing weren't coming from the figures around me, they were coming from somewhere else entirely, somewhere above us all. In that moment of clarity, I understood that I wasn't supposed to remember this. The blankness, the peaceful expression, the mirror-like reflection in my eyes, it was all meant to be permanent. But something had gone wrong, or perhaps right. A glitch in whatever process had been applied to us. The fragment ended there, cutting off just as I began to lower my head, just as something massive shifted in the darkness above us. I found myself back at my desk, gasping. The device was vibrating more rapidly now, almost frantically. The electronic sounds in the walls had returned, rising and falling in waves that seemed to respond to my heartbeat. That was when I noticed the shoes outside my neighbor's door had changed again. This time, both were facing my apartment, waiting. I don't know if my investigation is complete or if it's just beginning. The fragments feel like pieces of a larger puzzle, but I'm not sure I want to see the full picture. There's a part of me that wonders if the forgetting was a mercy, a protection from something too vast and strange for normal comprehension. But the other part, the part that found that recording and held that device and remembered those impossible lights, knows that forgetting isn't an option anymore. Whatever happened to me in that dark space isn't finished. It's been waiting, patient as the presence I felt behind me, for me to remember enough to return. The electronic sounds are getting louder now. The device hasn't stopped vibrating. And somewhere in the walls of my apartment, I can hear something that sounds almost like breathing, like static given life. The question isn't what happened to me in that place. The question is what's happening to me now, and whether the investigation I thought I was conducting was really an investigation at all. Or an invitation, Story 7. It was the scent of overripe oranges that greeted me, clinging to the air in the hallway. Sweet, almost intoxicating, yet distinctly out of place in a house that hadn't seen fresh fruit in weeks. I hesitated at the threshold, the unexpected aroma unraveling a string of memories I had long secured away. The walls seemed to lean in as if drawn by my confusion, and for a moment the hallway appeared narrower, tighter. I moved forward, drawn by a compulsion to find the source. The air grew dense with the scent, each step thickening the atmosphere. I remembered that smell from another house, another time, when the past felt like it could be rewritten. I shouldn't have followed it, but I did. The first dream came on a Tuesday, I think, though time felt fluid those days, like water running through cupped hands. I was lying in my bed, the familiar weight of the blanket across my chest, when I noticed the light, just a small thing really. A soft glow beneath the bedroom door, steady and warm, like someone had left a lamp on in the hallway. But I lived alone, and I always turned off the lights before sleeping. In the dream, I didn't get up to check. I simply watched that thin line of illumination seeping under the door, painting a golden stripe across the hardwood floor. It pulsed gently like breathing, like something alive on the other side, waiting. The light held my attention in a way that felt important, though I couldn't say why. When I woke, the house was dark, silent, just another stressed dream, I told myself. Work had been demanding lately, and my mind was processing the pressure in strange ways. But the dream returned. The second time I found myself in the same position, same blanket, same gentle weight across my chest. The light was there again, that warm glow beneath the door, but now it moved. Slow, deliberate shifts from left to right, as if someone were pacing in the hallway with a flashlight. The golden stripe on the floor swayed like wheat in a breeze I couldn't feel. In this dream there was sound, a constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. It vibrated through the floorboards, up through the mattress, into my bones. The sound had texture, layers within layers, almost musical but not quite, almost familiar but not quite. I wanted to get up, to open the door and see what was making that light dance, but my body felt heavy, weighted down by more than just the blanket. There was a voice in the hum, metallic and distant, like words spoken through water. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the tone was patient, persistent, like someone trying to explain something important to a child who wasn't quite ready to understand. When I woke, my ears were ringing. The third morning, I found my bedroom door slightly ajar. I always closed it before sleeping, a habit from childhood that had never left me. The gap was narrow, maybe an inch, but it was there, dark and still, like a mouth half open in sleep. I stared at it while getting dressed, trying to remember if I might have gotten up during the night, if I might have opened it myself and simply forgotten. The ringing in my ears hadn't stopped. At work, the fluorescent lights seemed brighter than usual, casting everything in a harsh, artificial glow that reminded me of something I couldn't place. The computer screen flickered intermittently, showing brief flashes of static that made my colleagues complain about the old equipment. But when I looked at the static, really looked at it, I could almost see patterns in the chaos, almost see shapes trying to form. The scent of oranges followed me home that evening, faint but persistent, like it had soaked into my clothes. I searched the house room by room, looking for the source, but found nothing. No fruit, no air freshener, no logical explanation. Just that sweet, overripe smell that seemed to grow stronger near the bedroom door. That night the dream was different, longer, more vivid than reality had been during the day. I was in my bed again, but this time I could see more than just the light under the door. The room was filled with a soft, ambient glow that had no obvious source. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as it was, but somehow more present, more real. The colors were deeper, the textures more pronounced. I could feel the individual threads in the pillowcase against my cheek, count the dust motes floating in the air. The light beneath the door had changed too. It was oval now, unmoving, but pulsing like a breath, always above me, even though it was clearly coming from the hallway. The geometry didn't make sense, but in the dream it didn't need to. Dreams have their own logic, their own rules about space and time and the way light behaves. The humming was louder now, more complex. I could distinguish different frequencies, different tones weaving together in patterns that felt almost like language. The metallic voice was clearer too, though still not quite audible. It spoke in rhythm with the pulsing light, patient and persistent, like it had been trying to reach me for a very long time. I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved. A gentle upward pressure, like floating in warm water, like being held by invisible hands. The sensation was not unpleasant, but it was wrong somehow. Bodies don't float in empty air. Gravity doesn't simply stop working because you're dreaming. There was a scent in the dream air, sharp and clean, like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more artificial. It mixed with the lingering sweetness of oranges, creating something entirely new, something that made my mouth water and my stomach clench at the same time. When I tried to move, to sit up and investigate, I found that I could not because I was paralyzed, but because moving seemed unnecessary, counterproductive, like struggling against a current that was already carrying me where I needed to go. The dream lasted hours, or felt like it did. Time moved strangely, stretching and contracting like a rubber band. Sometimes the light pulsed quickly and everything accelerated. Sometimes it slowed to barely perceptible throbs, and the world around me became thick as honey. The voice spoke continuously throughout, its metallic cadence never varying, never stopping, even when I wanted desperately to hear silence. I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth. The fourth day brought physical evidence I couldn't dismiss. A small mark on my left wrist, perfectly circular, about the size of a dime. It wasn't painful, wasn't raised or discolored, just a faint impression in the skin, like someone had pressed a coin against it while it was soft. I had no memory of injuring myself, no recollection of anything that could have caused such a mark. The computer at work was acting worse. The static had become almost constant, and several colleagues mentioned that the interference seemed to follow me from station to station. When I sat at different desks throughout the day, the screens would flicker within minutes of my arrival. The IT department was baffled. They ran diagnostics, checked connections, replaced cables, but nothing helped. During lunch, I noticed that I couldn't taste my food properly. Everything seemed muted, distant, like I was experiencing flavor through a thick membrane. The only sensation that came through clearly was that lingering sweetness of overripe oranges, even though I was eating a sandwich that contained nothing remotely citrus. The afternoon passed in a haze. I found myself losing track of conversations mid-sentence, staring at my computer screen without seeing it, listening to sounds that no one else seemed to hear. Soft humming from the air conditioning vents, metallic whispers from the fluorescent lights, frequencies that felt familiar, that made my bones vibrate in recognition. By evening, I was questioning my own perception of reality. The fifth dream was more vivid than waking life had ever been. I was in my room, but it was more than my room. Every detail was hyperreal, every surface more textured, every color more saturated than anything I had ever experienced while awake. The walls breathed gently, expanding and contracting in rhythm with my heartbeat. The ceiling seemed higher, stretching up into soft darkness that felt infinite. The oval light was directly above me now, no longer coming from beneath the door. It pulsed with that same steady rhythm, but I could see into it, see layers of illumination folding in on themselves like origami made of pure luminescence. The light was warm against my skin, though it cast no shadows. The humming had become a symphony, complex harmonies that seemed to originate from inside my own body, frequencies that resonated in my chest, my skull, my bones. I could understand it now, not the words but the meaning behind them. It was explanation, it was invitation, it was recognition of something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. I was floating now, definitely floating, several inches above the mattress. I could see my body below me, peaceful and still, chest rising and falling in sleep. But I was also in my body, feeling the gentle upward pressure, the weightless suspension that defied everything I knew about physics. Time had become meaningless. The dream could have lasted minutes or months. I existed in a bubble of extended present where past and future were just concepts without substance. The voice spoke to me throughout, its metallic tones now warm and familiar, like hearing an old friend's voice after years of separation. The scent was stronger too, ozone and oranges and something else, something that reminded me of childhood summers and places I had never been and memories that weren't quite mine. It filled my lungs completely, became the only air I needed to breathe. When I tried to look toward the door to see if it was open or closed, I found that my perspective had changed. I was seeing the room from above, from an angle that should have been impossible. The door was gone. The walls were gone. I was floating in space that extended infinitely in all directions, but somehow I was still in my bedroom, still surrounded by familiar objects that pulsed with that same gentle light. I woke to find my bedroom door wide open and the hallway light on. But I lived alone. I always turned off the lights before sleeping. I always closed my door. The 6th day was when the boundaries began to dissolve completely. I heard the humming while I was awake, soft at first, barely audible beneath the normal sounds of daily life, but growing stronger as the hours passed. It seemed to come from electrical devices, from the walls themselves, from the spaces between sounds where silence should have been. The mark on my wrist had spread, not larger but deeper, more defined. When I touched it, I could feel a slight vibration, like a tuning fork pressed against the skin. The sensation traveled up my arm, into my shoulder, settling in my chest where it matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. At work, I lost 3 hours. I remember sitting down at my desk in the morning, and then suddenly it was afternoon and my colleagues were asking if I was feeling all right. I had no memory of the intervening time, no awareness of what I had been doing. My computer screen showed work that I didn't remember completing, emails I didn't remember sending. The static on the screens had evolved. Instead of random interference, it was showing patterns now. Geometric shapes that formed and dissolved in sequences that felt meaningful, like a language I was on the verge of understanding. When I tried to point them out to others, they said they saw only standard electronic noise. The scent of oranges had become constant, so pervasive that I had stopped noticing it consciously. But it was there, underlying every other smell, turning fresh air into something thick and sweet and artificial. It clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. It had become part of me. That evening, I began to suspect that they weren't dreams at all. The realization came gradually, like sunrise through fog. The physical evidence was undeniable. The marks on my skin, the lost time, the electronic interference that followed me everywhere. The way reality felt less substantial than the experiences I was having while supposedly asleep. What if I had been awake during those nights? What if something had been happening to me, something that I was meant to forget, but the forgetting wasn't quite complete? The thought should have been terrifying, but instead it brought a strange sense of relief, like finally remembering something that had been nagging at the edge of consciousness, like finding a puzzle piece that made the whole picture suddenly make sense. I went to bed that night with a mixture of anticipation and dread, wondering what I would experience, wondering if I would remember it clearly this time. The 7th dream was identical to the first ones, but I knew immediately that it was no longer a dream. I was lying in my bed, the familiar weight of the blanket across my chest, watching the soft glow beneath the bedroom door. The light pulsed gently, like breathing, like something alive on the other side, waiting. But this time I could feel the photons against my skin. I could count the individual waves of illumination as they passed under the door and across the floor. The humming began, that constant frequency that had become as familiar as my own voice. But now I could hear the machinery behind it, the complex systems that generated those carefully modulated tones. I could sense the intelligence directing the patterns, the purpose behind the patient, persistent communication. The oval light appeared above me, pulsing with its steady rhythm, and I could see through it now, see the source of the illumination. Technology beyond anything I had ever imagined, but somehow familiar, like remembering something from a half-forgotten dream. I felt the gentle upward pressure, the weightless suspension that I now knew was not a dream sensation, but a physical reality. My body was being lifted, held, examined by forces that operated according to rules I didn't understand but was beginning to accept. The metallic voice spoke to me, and this time I understood every word. It wasn't speaking English, wasn't speaking any human language, but meaning flowed directly into my consciousness without the need for translation. It told me about the other times, the visits I had forgotten, the careful process of contact and communication that had been ongoing for much longer than I had realized. It told me about the marks, the lost time, the electronic interference, side effects of a process that was almost complete, a connection that was almost fully established. It told me that forgetting was normal, expected, a natural defense mechanism that would fade as the integration progressed. The scent of oranges was explained too, a side effect of the neural interface, a cross-wiring of sensory input that would stabilize once the process was finished. The artificial ozone was the smell of their technology, leaking through into my perception as the boundaries between their reality and mine became increasingly permeable. Time stretched and contracted around me as it always did, but now I understood that this was because time itself was being manipulated, carefully controlled to allow for the extended contact necessary for proper communication. Hours were compressed into minutes, minutes expanded into subjective days, all to facilitate the gradual process of connection. I floated in the warm light, understanding finally flowing through me like water through a sponge. I was not being harmed or violated. I was being invited, welcomed, prepared for something larger than my individual existence. The fear I had been carrying dissolved, replaced by a sense of belonging that I had never experienced before. When I woke the next morning, I found a perfect orange on my nightstand, its skin unmarked, its scent exactly matching the phantom aroma that had been following me for days. I lived alone. My house had contained no fresh fruit for weeks. The orange was impossible, but it was real. I could touch it, smell it, feel its weight in my hands. When I peeled it, the sections were perfectly formed, and when I tasted them, they were sweeter than any orange I had ever eaten. The mark on my wrist had become a perfect circle now, slightly raised, warm to the touch. When I pressed it, I could feel the humming resonate through my entire body, could sense the connection that had been established, the communication channel that would never again be closed. I understood that the dreams would continue, but they would no longer be dreams. They would be meetings, conversations, preparations for something that was coming, something that I was being readied to receive. The process was almost complete, the integration nearly finished. The boundaries between sleeping and waking, between their reality and mine, had dissolved completely. I existed now in a space between worlds, a bridge between different forms of consciousness, a translator between species that had been trying to communicate for longer than I could comprehend. The orange sat on my kitchen counter as I prepared for work, impossible and undeniable, sweet and artificial, a physical anchor in a reality that had become fluid and strange and wonderful. The scent filled my house completely now, no longer phantom but real, no longer memory but present moment. I smiled as I locked the door behind me, knowing that when I returned that evening, there would be more evidence, more proof, more pieces of a puzzle that was finally, beautifully coming together. The humming followed me as I walked to my car, gentle and constant and welcoming, a frequency that had become the soundtrack of my transformation. I was no longer alone, no longer limited to the narrow bandwidth of human perception. I was becoming something more, Starry 8. I mentioned I'd only stayed on the ground floor, that the rain had kept me near the entrance, away from anything more. They seemed satisfied, jotting notes in rhythm with the drizzle outside, yet the damp scent of old wood lingered on my fingertips, stubborn and telling. The stairs had creaked a note that still echoed in my mind, carrying the weight of untold steps. A slight draft brushed my cheek with the chill of an unwelcome memory. The hallway light flickered, casting shadows that knew my path. I didn't mention the door half ajar or the coat beside it, but the mud was drying on my shoes. The humming started somewhere behind my left ear. Not music, not mechanical, something between the two, like electricity learning to sing. I press my palm against the side of my head now, weeks later, and I can still feel it vibrating through my skull. It wasn't loud, that's what made it worse. Quiet enough that I questioned whether it was real, persistent enough that I couldn't ignore it. The air tasted metallic when it happened. Copper pennies dissolving on my tongue. My teeth ached with it. Someone was watching me sleep. I know this the way you know you're falling in a dream, that sudden certainty that jerks you awake. But I wasn't asleep, or maybe I was. The ceiling above my bed had a water stain that looked different in the darkness, spreading like fingers reaching down toward my face. My skin felt exposed, even under the covers. The sensation of eyes on me was so strong I could almost feel the weight of their gaze pressing against my chest. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. But the nothing felt occupied, crowded with presence I couldn't name. My thoughts began stuttering. Words would start in my mind and then fracture, breaking apart like glass hitting concrete. I think I need to, and then the sentence would dissolve, leaving only the taste of unfinished intentions. Simple tasks became impossible puzzles. Reaching for a doorknob required planning, as if my hand belonged to someone else and I had to negotiate with it. The mirror in my bathroom reflected my face half a second too late. I'd move my head and my reflection would follow, always catching up, never quite synchronized. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, brilliant white that didn't illuminate anything, just existed in the space around me like thick liquid. I couldn't see my hands in front of my face, but the brightness burned through my closed eyelids. Something was moving in the light, shapes that weren't shapes, presence without form. The silence was absolute, not quiet, absent, as if sound itself had been carefully removed from the world, leaving only the pressure of things that should have made noise but didn't. My heartbeat felt muffled, distant, like it was happening to someone else. The ringing won't stop. It's been days now, maybe weeks. A high, thin sound that sits just behind my consciousness, threading through every thought. I catch myself tilting my head to one side, trying to pour it out like water in my ear. The frequency changes sometimes, shifting higher until it's almost beyond hearing, then dropping back down to that persistent whine. When I'm alone, I find myself humming along with it, matching the pitch without meaning to. My voice sounds strange when I do this, hollow and unfamiliar. But that's not how it happened. The light wasn't white at all. It was the color of old brass, tarnished and warm, pooling in corners like spilled honey. I could see everything clearly in that light, too clearly. The grain in the wooden walls, the dust motes hanging perfectly still in the air, my own hands translucent as paper. The shapes weren't moving through the light, they were part of it, woven into its texture like patterns in fabric, and there was sound. A low thrumming that I felt in my bones, rhythmic as breathing but too slow, too deep. My heartbeat tried to match it and couldn't, creating a stuttering discord in my chest. I don't try to understand anymore. Understanding requires linear thinking, cause and effect, the luxury of believing that memories happen in order. Instead, I carry these fragments like stones in my pocket, smooth and heavy with handling. Sometimes I take them out and examine them, turning them over in my mind, but they never fit together the way they should. The humming comes and goes. The light visits me in dreams that might not be dreams. The sensation of being watched has become as familiar as my own breathing. I've learned to live with the spaces between thoughts, the gaps where my mind used to work smoothly. Something fundamental shifted that day, some basic assumption about how reality operates. I can feel it in the way shadows fall differently now, in the way silence has weight and texture. The mud on my shoes has long since been cleaned away, but the path it traced through that house remains mapped in my memory, leading always to that half-open door and the coat that hung beside it like a question I'll never be brave enough to answer. Story 9. The notification light didn't blink. My fingers brushed the screen, seeking the familiar vibration, but it remained inert, unresponsive. The chair creaked under my weight without the usual reassuring groan, as though it too held its breath. The room drew in closer, the quiet pressing at the edges, and when I expected the distant hum of distant traffic, there was only a void. I focused on the wallpaper's pattern, each line and swirl pretending, as if any moment they might shift and betray their true design. The absence filled the space, tangible, as if daring me to acknowledge what had ceased to exist. I'm trying to piece it together now. The fragments come in waves, crashing against the shore of consciousness before retreating into darkness. Some days I can almost taste the metallic air that clung to my tongue. Other days, nothing, just the echo of something that might have been a scream or maybe laughter. I can't tell anymore. There was a corridor, long, the kind that stretches forever in dreams, where your footsteps sound wrong, too hollow, like walking inside a drum. The fluorescent lights above flickered in a pattern that wasn't random. I remember thinking that the pattern meant something. But what? My hand traced along the wall as I walked, and the texture felt familiar under my palm. Rough, cold, like concrete that had been painted over too many times. The smell comes back first, always the smell. Copper pennies left in rain. Ozone after lightning strikes too close. It filled my nostrils until I couldn't breathe anything else. Even now, writing this, I catch traces of it lingering in the corners of rooms, seeping through ventilation systems that shouldn't carry such things. I remember a door, heavy, the kind that requires your whole body weight to open. My shoulder pressed against it, and I felt the vibration travel through the metal, a low hum that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep beneath the floor. The handle was warm, too warm, as if someone had been gripping it for hours before I arrived. But when did I arrive? How did I get there? The gaps in my memory feel deliberate, carved out with surgical precision. I'll be remembering the taste of stale coffee, the way my shoes squeaked against linoleum, and then nothing. A blank space where hours should be. When the memories resume, I'm somewhere else entirely, standing in a room with no windows, watching condensation form on pipes that ran along the ceiling like arteries. There was music, or something like music, a frequency that made my teeth ache. It came from everywhere and nowhere, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat until I couldn't distinguish between the sound and the blood rushing in my ears. I pressed my palms against my temples, but the pressure only made it louder. Someone was there, I think, a figure at the edge of my vision, never quite in focus. When I turned to look directly, they dissolved into shadow and suggestion, but I felt their presence like heat from a body standing too close. Their breathing synchronized with mine until I held my breath just to break the pattern. The walls were covered in something, paper, fabric. It moved when I wasn't looking, rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand. I reached out to touch it, and my fingers came away damp. The moisture had no color, no scent, but it left a residue that burned slightly, like salt on an open wound. I keep returning to the chair, my chair, the one I'm sitting in now. It was there too, in that place, identical in every way. The same worn armrest where my elbow rests, the same loose thread in the upholstery that I twist between my fingers when I'm thinking. How can that be? I brought it with me when I moved here years ago. I remember carrying it up 3 flights of stairs, cursing its weight. But there it was, waiting for me in that windowless room. The temperature kept changing. One moment I was shivering, my breath visible in the air, and the next I was sweating through my clothes. The fabric clung to my skin like it was afraid to let go. I tried to remove my jacket, but my arms wouldn't cooperate. They felt heavy, disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. There was a table, round, its surface reflected nothing, absorbing light like a black hole. Objects appeared on it without explanation. A glass of water that was always half empty, never half full. A pen that wrote in ink the color of dried blood. Papers covered in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow knew was mine. I wrote things, I'm certain of that, page after page of words that made sense while I was writing them, but dissolved into gibberish the moment I looked away. The pen moved across the paper with a scratching sound that echoed too loudly in the silence. Each stroke felt like carving letters into stone. The figure moved closer. I could sense their approach without seeing it, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The air grew thick, oppressive. My lungs worked harder to extract oxygen from atmosphere that seemed to be thinning. They stood behind my chair, and I felt their presence like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. They spoke, I think they spoke, words that bypassed my ears and embedded themselves directly into my thoughts. The language was familiar yet foreign, like hearing your native tongue spoken with an accent you can't place. The meaning slipped away even as I grasped for it, leaving only the impression of something important, something I needed to understand. My reflection in the black table began to change, subtle at first. A slight alteration in the angle of my jaw, the color of my eyes shifting by degrees. I watched myself become someone else, someone I recognized but couldn't name. The transformation was gradual, hypnotic. I couldn't look away even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The walls began to breathe, in and out, like the ribs of some enormous creature. The rhythm was wrong, too slow for a human heartbeat, too fast for sleep. I placed my palm against the surface and felt the pulse beneath, warm and alive and utterly alien. Time became elastic, minutes stretched into hours, hours compressed into seconds. I would start to write a sentence and find it already completed in handwriting that grew more unfamiliar with each word. The papers multiplied, covering the table, spilling onto the floor, each page identical yet somehow different. The humming grew louder. It came from inside my skull now, reverberating through bone and tissue until my entire head became a resonating chamber. I could feel it in my teeth, my fingernails, the spaces between my ribs. The sound had texture, weight, presence. It was trying to tell me something. I stood up. The chair protested with a creak that sounded exactly like the one I heard when this all started, or ended. I can't tell which came first anymore. The figure watched me rise, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of their face. My face, but wrong, older, tired, eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. The door was still there, still warm to the touch. I pressed my ear against it and heard sounds from the other side. Familiar sounds, traffic, voices, the ordinary world continuing its ordinary business, oblivious to the impossibility unfolding just beyond their perception. I turned the handle. It moved easily now, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Light spilled through the gap, harsh and white and real. I stepped forward and the floor gave way beneath my feet, not falling exactly, more like sinking into something soft and yielding and infinite. Then I was here, in this room, in this chair, with these memories that feel like dreams and these dreams that feel like memories. The papers are gone, the table is gone, the figure is gone, but the smell lingers, and sometimes, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, I hear the humming. I've been writing this for hours, or minutes, or days. The words flow like water through my fingers, impossible to contain or control. Each sentence reveals something I didn't know I knew, each paragraph a window into experiences that feel both foreign and intimately mine. The wallpaper pattern is shifting again, just slightly, just enough to make me question what I saw versus what I'm seeing now. The lines curve differently, the swirls spiral in the opposite direction, but when I look directly at them, they freeze, pretending to be ordinary decoration in an ordinary room. My phone screen remains dark, no notifications, no missed calls, no evidence that the outside world remembers I exist. I pick it up and see my reflection in the black surface. For just a moment, I look like someone else. Someone I met in that other place, that impossible room that exists somewhere between memory and nightmare. The chair creaks beneath me, and I remember sitting in this exact position while a figure stood behind me, breathing in rhythm with my lungs. I can almost feel their presence now, hovering just outside my peripheral vision, waiting for me to turn around. But I don't turn around. I keep writing, keep trying to capture these fragments before they dissolve back into the darkness where forgotten things go to hide. The pen moves across the paper with that same scratching sound, and I realize I'm using the same pen, the one that writes in ink the color of dried blood. How is that possible? The temperature is changing again. My breath mists in the suddenly cold air, and I pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The same jacket I couldn't remove in that other place. The fabric feels damp against my skin, as if it's been soaked in something I can't identify. There's a knock at the door, soft, deliberate, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, a pattern that feels significant but whose meaning eludes me. I stand up and the chair protests with that familiar creak. My footsteps sound wrong as I cross the room, too hollow, like walking inside a drum. The handle is warm beneath my palm, too warm. I press my ear against the door and hear nothing but the absence of sound, a void that presses against my eardrums like deep water. But I know someone is there, waiting on the other side, breathing in rhythm with my heartbeat. I don't open the door. Instead, I return to my chair, to these papers, to these words that spill out of me like blood from a wound I didn't know I had. The knocking stops, but the presence remains, patient and persistent and utterly familiar. The memories are getting stronger now, more vivid, more insistent. They demand attention, demand acknowledgement, demand that I remember what I've been trying so hard to forget. The metallic taste is back, coating my tongue with the flavor of copper pennies and ozone. The humming has returned too, a low frequency that makes my bones ache. I think I'm beginning to understand, or maybe understanding is beginning to me. The distinction seems meaningless now. like the difference between dreaming and waking, between memory and reality, between who I was and who I'm becoming. The figure is back, standing behind my chair, breathing down my neck with breath that smells like stale air and forgotten things. I can feel their presence like heat, like weight, like the promise of revelations I'm not sure I want to receive. They're trying to tell me something, have been trying all along. The words bypass my ears and embed themselves directly into my consciousness, foreign yet familiar, meaningful yet incomprehensible. I'm starting to recognize the language now, starting to decode the message that's been waiting for me to remember how to listen. The walls are breathing again. The wallpaper shifts and swirls, patterns rearranging themselves into configurations that hurt to look at directly. The room is changing, becoming something else, something that exists in the spaces between what is and what might be. I keep writing, but the words are no longer entirely mine. They flow through me like water through a conduit, carrying meanings I don't fully grasp but somehow know are true. The pen scratches against paper with increasing urgency, as if time is running out, as if there's something crucial that must be recorded before it's too late. The knocking at the door resumes. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, but now I realize it's not coming from outside. It's coming from inside, from somewhere deep within the walls, from the spaces between spaces where impossible things wait patiently for their moment to emerge. My reflection in the phone screen is wrong again, older, tired, eyes that have seen beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception and can never quite find their way back. I touch the surface, and for a moment my reflection touches back, our fingertips meeting in the dark space between worlds. The smell is overwhelming now, filling my nostrils, coating my throat, seeping into my pores until it becomes part of me. Copper and ozone and something else, something organic and warm and disturbingly familiar. It's the smell of transformation, of boundaries dissolving, of realities bleeding into one another until the distinction becomes meaningless. I'm running out of words, or words are running out of me. The pen grows heavy in my hand, the letters blur on the page, and the scratching sound fades into the encompassing hum that has become the soundtrack to my existence. The figure behind me leans closer, and I can feel their breath on my neck, warm and moist and carrying whispers in that language I'm finally beginning to understand. They're telling me it's time to remember, time to acknowledge, time to become what I was always meant to be. The memories aren't fragments anymore, they're pieces of a puzzle assembling themselves into a picture I never wanted to see but can no longer avoid. The room is dissolving around me, walls melting like wax, floor becoming fluid beneath my feet. But the chair remains solid, real, an anchor in the storm of transformation. I grip the armrests and feel the familiar worn fabric, the loose thread I've twisted between my fingers for years, the weight that made me curse when I carried it up 3 flights of stairs. But I never carried it anywhere. It was always here, waiting for me to find my way back, waiting for me to remember what I've spent so long trying to forget. The chair, the room, the figure, the impossible memories that feel more real than reality itself. I understand now, or I'm beginning to. The notification light never blinked because there was no one left to send notifications. The chair never creaked because I never really left it. The wallpaper never shifted because it was never really wallpaper at all. The pen falls from my fingers and the scratching stops. The silence that follows is not empty but full, pregnant with possibilities and revelations and truths that exist just beyond the edge of comprehension. The figure steps around the chair, and I see their face clearly for the first time. My face, but not as I am now, as I will be, as I'm becoming. as I've always been in the spaces between heartbeats, in the gaps between memories, in the silence between words. They smile and I feel my own lips curve in response. The transformation is almost complete now, has always been complete, was never really a transformation at all but a remembering, a return to what was always true beneath the layers of ordinary perception and mundane reality. The humming reaches a crescendo, and I realize it's not coming from outside or inside, but from the space between the two, from the boundary that's dissolving even as I try to define it. My consciousness expands, contracts, expands again, like breathing but deeper, more fundamental, more real than anything I've ever experienced. Something has reawakened and the memories are growing stronger. Story 10. The initial assessment showed all windows latched securely. Furniture placement appeared untouched, with chairs aligned to the dining table and the sofa free of debris. A calendar on the wall noted dates without any markings beyond printed numbers. In the kitchen, utensils were stowed correctly, though a single plate remained on the countertop, devoid of residue. The refrigerator hummed at the expected decibel level, yet its contents failed to match inventory records. The hallway carpet was vacuumed, leaving uniform lines, yet the air felt colder than usual. The ceiling fan was off, but the blades rotated slowly. I remember writing that report. I remember the methodical way I documented everything, room by room, detail by detail. What I don't remember is why I was writing it, or who asked me to. The handwriting looks like mine, but the words feel foreign, clinical, like someone else's thoughts flowing through my pen. The dream started 3 weeks after I found that report in my kitchen drawer. In the first dream, I was lying in my bed, but the room felt different, stretched. The walls seemed farther away than they should be, and there was a light coming from somewhere I couldn't identify. Not harsh, not warm, just present. An oval light, unmoving but pulsing like a breath, always above me. I woke up thinking about work stress. The mind does strange things when you're tired, creates impossible architectures, bends familiar spaces into something alien. I made coffee and forgot about it. But the dream came back. The second time I was in that same elongated room, but now I could hear something beneath the silence. A constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. The oval light was still there, pulsing in rhythm with something I couldn't place. My heartbeat maybe, or breathing that wasn't my own. I tried to sit up in the dream, but my body felt heavy, disconnected, like I was underwater or wrapped in something thick and yielding. There was a voice, metallic and distant, speaking words that dissolved before I could understand them. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, filtering through the hum like radio static. When I woke, my sheets were damp with sweat, and there was a sharp scent in the air, like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more artificial. I opened all the windows, but the smell lingered. That morning I found the plate. It was on my kitchen counter, the same plate from my report, clean, white, devoid of residue, but I hadn't used it. I eat from bowls mostly, and I always put dishes away immediately after washing them. The plate sat there like an accusation, like evidence of something I couldn't remember doing. I put it back in the cabinet and tried not to think about it. The third dream lasted longer. I was in that stretched room again, but now I could feel movement around me. Not footsteps, not the rustle of fabric, but something more fundamental, the displacement of air, the subtle shift that happens when someone enters your peripheral vision, even when you can't see them. The oval light pulsed faster now, and the humming had developed layers. harmonics that seemed to respond to my breathing, my pulse, the electrical activity in my brain. I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved, rising without motion, floating without weightlessness. The metallic voice was clearer this time, though the words still escaped me. They felt important, urgent, like instructions I was supposed to follow. But every time I focused on the meaning, the sounds would dissolve back into static, leaving only the impression of communication. I tried to turn my head toward the voice, but the room seemed to rotate around me instead. The walls breathing in and out, the ceiling lowering and rising like a slow tide, and always that oval light watching from above. I woke to find my bedroom door open. I always close it before sleep, always. It's a habit so ingrained I don't even think about it anymore. But there it was, standing wide, revealing the hallway beyond. The carpet showed those same uniform vacuum lines from my report, though I couldn't remember cleaning it recently. I got up to close the door, and that's when I noticed the mark on my arm. It was small, perfectly circular, about the size of a dime. Not a bruise, not a cut, but something else. A slight discoloration, like a faint burn or the ghost of a vaccination. It didn't hurt, didn't itch, didn't feel like anything at all, but it was there on my left forearm in a place I would have noticed before. I stood in the hallway, touching the mark, trying to remember how it might have happened. The air felt colder than usual, just like in my report. The ceiling fan was off, but when I looked up, I could swear I saw the blades moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but moving. The dreams began to change after that. Not just at night anymore. I would find myself drifting during the day, losing minutes or sometimes hours to that stretched room with its pulsing light. I'd be reading or washing dishes or staring out the window, and suddenly I'd be back in that space between spaces, listening to the modulated hum and the metallic voice that always seemed on the verge of making sense. The boundaries started to blur. I would hear the humming while awake, a subtle undertone to ordinary sounds. The refrigerator's motor would take on those same harmonic layers. The air conditioning would pulse in rhythm with that oval light. Electronics began to behave strangely. My radio would pick up frequencies that weren't there, playing silence with texture, emptiness with weight. My phone started making calls I didn't initiate. The screen would light up, showing numbers I didn't recognize, connecting to destinations that answered with that same metallic voice. I would hang up immediately, but the calls kept coming. Always at the same time, always to the same strange numbers that seemed to shift and change when I tried to write them down. The mark on my arm was growing. Not larger but more defined. What had been a faint discoloration was becoming something else. A pattern, maybe. Concentric circles with lines radiating outward, like a diagram of something I should understand but couldn't. It still didn't hurt, still felt like nothing at all, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. I started documenting everything, writing reports like the one I'd found in my drawer, cataloging the small inconsistencies that were accumulating around me, objects in wrong places, sounds without sources. The way time seemed to skip and stutter, leaving gaps I couldn't account for. But every report I wrote would disappear. I'd leave it on my desk, go to sleep, and wake to find it gone. Not thrown away, not misplaced, just gone, as if it had never existed at all. The dreams were becoming more real than reality. In that stretched room, I could feel everything with perfect clarity. The texture of the air, the weight of the light, the subtle vibrations that ran through whatever surface supported me. My senses were sharper there, more focused, as if the waking world was just a pale reflection of that other place. The metallic voice was speaking constantly now, a stream of communication that felt like conversation even though I couldn't understand the words. Sometimes I found myself responding, forming sounds that weren't quite language but carried meaning anyway. We were discussing something important, something that mattered more than anything in my ordinary life. And I was beginning to remember. Not specific events, but impressions. The sense that this had all happened before, many times before. The stretched room, the oval light, the voice that spoke in frequencies my conscious mind couldn't process. It felt like coming home, like returning to a place I'd forgotten I'd ever left. The mark on my arm was complete now. A perfect geometric pattern that seemed to shift depending on how I looked at it. Sometimes it appeared flat, a simple design drawn on skin. Other times it looked three-dimensional, as if it extended both into and out of my arm, existing in spaces that shouldn't be there. People started to notice, not the mark itself, which I kept covered, but something about me. The way I would pause mid-sentence, listening to sounds they couldn't hear. The way I would stare at lights that seemed ordinary to them but pulsed with meaning for me. They would ask if I was feeling all right, if I needed to see someone, if I was getting enough sleep. But how could I explain that sleep and waking were becoming the same thing? That the dreams were more consistent than reality, more reliable, more true? The room in my dreams was expanding. What had once been just a stretched bedroom was becoming something larger, more complex. Corridors that led to other rooms, each one filled with that same oval light, that same modulated hum. I could walk now, or something like walking, moving through spaces that followed their own logic, their own geometry. And I wasn't alone. There were others in those corridors, figures I could sense but never quite see. They moved with purpose, going about tasks I couldn't identify but somehow understood. We were all part of something larger, something important, something that required this careful, methodical process of remembering. Because that's what this was, not dreaming but remembering. Piece by piece, layer by layer, recovering something that had been carefully hidden away. The metallic voice was my own. I realized this during what I still thought of as the fifth dream, though the distinction between dreams and waking had become meaningless. I was speaking to myself, or to another version of myself, across some gap that wasn't quite space and wasn't quite time. Giving instructions, receiving reports, coordinating activities that spanned multiple states of being. The mark on my arm was warm now, generating its own subtle heat. When I touched it, I could feel the vibration of machinery, the pulse of systems operating just beyond the threshold of perception. It wasn't a mark at all, but an interface, a connection point to something vast and complex and utterly familiar. I stopped trying to distinguish between dream and reality. Instead, I let myself flow between states, following the rhythms of the oval light, the patterns of the modulated hum. My ordinary life became a performance, a role I played during certain hours while my real existence continued in those expanded spaces, those rooms that existed in the gaps between moments. The reports I wrote now stayed where I left them, not because anything had changed, but because I was finally writing them in the right state of consciousness, documenting the right layer of reality. They were part of the process, part of the careful work of integration that had been going on much longer than I'd realized. Everything was exactly as it should be. The stretched room, the pulsing light, the voice that spoke in frequencies below language. The mark that wasn't a mark, the dreams that weren't dreams, the memories that had been waiting patiently for me to remember them. I understand now that this isn't ending, but beginning. Not a breakdown of boundaries between dream and reality, but a recognition that those boundaries were always arbitrary, always temporary. The real work happens in the spaces between, in the rooms that exist only when you stop insisting they can't. Tonight I'm lying in my bed, but the room feels different, stretched. The walls seem farther away than they should be, and there's a light coming from somewhere I can identify now perfectly clearly. An oval light, unmoving but pulsing like a breath, always above me. But this time when I reach up to touch it, my fingers meet something solid, something real, something that shouldn't be there but is. And I know I'm not dreaming anymore.